Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at What is Communist Anarchism by Alexander Berkman, Phoenix Press, originally published as ABC of Anarchism in 1929. This print is from 1989. The key idea of this text is, surprise, surprise, defining what is communist anarchism. Here, Berkman is addressing confusions and misinformation about the terms and identifying what are communist anarchism's goals and who opposes them. The book does take a slight aside at the end to address the shortcomings of the Russian Revolution, perhaps to elaborate how state, or perhaps siege communism as is sometimes called, had many flaws which communist anarchism would not commit. I would say a modern equivalent to this last section would be to compare the failings of the supposed left-leaning Obama administration and to argue that communist anarchism would better fulfill the goals of people on the political left. Let's take a look at the text in depth. Introduction. Berkman starts by addressing the myths and confusions surrounding anarchism. He states, "Neither your political boss, not your employer, neither your capitalist nor the policeman will speak to you honestly about anarchism." But this isn't too surprising. Any group deemed undesirable by the dominant narrative has derogatory and false myths spread about them. Berkman continues, "First of all, what anarchism is not. It is not bombs, disorder, or chaos. It is not robbery and murder. It is not a war of each against all. It is not a return to barbarism or to the wild state of man. Anarchism is the very opposite of all that." Berkman then lays out in detail how he defines anarchism and concludes, "In short, anarchism means a condition or society where all men and women are free and where all enjoy equally the benefits of an ordered and sensible life." Chapter 1. What do you want out of life? Berkman explains that we should have and want economic equality because no person is independently wealthy. We all produce the wealth of society. Berkman states, "Today no man can live by his own work. He must be helped by the labor of others. Therefore, all that we have, all wealth, is the product of the labor of many people, even of many generations. That is to say, all labor and the products of labor are social, made by society as a whole. Let's say a person is totally self-employed. They sell furniture made by hand from wood that they harvest, yet at every step of the way, from the knowledge of wood craftsmanship to the mining of the metals made to create the woodworking tools, what we produce is produced socially over a great many people and generations." Berkman is arguing, as any communist would, that what we likely want out of life is to get out of it what we put into it. We want more autonomy, democracy, and equality. Chapter 2. The Wage System. Here, Berkman further critiques the disparities between who does the work and who receives the wealth. Here he defines the wage system thusly. The workers build factories, make machinery and tools, and produce goods. The employers keep the factories, the machinery, tools, and goods for themselves as profit, and the worker gets only wages. Pretty self-explanatory, don't need to spend too much time on it, moving right along. Chapter 3. Law and Government. Berkman starts this chapter by asking to what extent the government, as the founders so-called intended, functions with the consent of the governed. Berkman comes to the conclusion that the public consents to being governed like a person robbed at gunpoint consents to giving over their possessions, namely, that we consent over the threat of violence. Derek Jensen has argued that many in Western society feel like violence is not a factor in their lives, but that's because avoiding violence comes from complying with the current system. If we refuse to pay taxes or refuse to pay our rent, we would be fined, then maybe given a court date, then maybe led to court or jail. If we refused all these things every step along the way, eventually violence would force us to comply with the current system. Berkman concludes that the government actually works to limit economic freedom, which in turn limits political freedom. He states, "Capitalist robs and exploits the whole of the people. The laws legitimize and uphold this capitalist robbery. The government uses one part of the people to aid and protect the capitalists in robbing the whole of the people. The entire thing is kept up by educating the people to believe that capitalism is right, that the law is just, and that the government must be obeyed." Chapter 4. How the System Works. Berkman explains that the system functions because the way it operates isn't challenged or questioned. because the church, the lawmaker, the society, etc. tell us that it must be so. Berkman explains, the conditions of existence suppress and stifle the instincts of kindness and humanity in us, and harden us against the need and misery of our fellow man. We are taught that behaving competitively in this capitalist way is part of our nature. But Michael Albert argues that this is not part of our nature. We don't exchange goods in our household or with our friends by competing for them. We recognize the needs of others and strive for fairness and understanding. In fact, any friend who did treat their friends and family with a competitive capitalist mindset would be deemed an asshole. Moving right along, Berkman then asks us, who causes more misery? The rich manufacturer reducing the wages of thousands of workers to swell his profits, or the jobless man stealing something to keep from starving? In the same vein, most people on death row only killed 1 or 2 people, and yet companies that cut corners that lead to unsafe working conditions or dangerous products can kill several people and receive a mere fine. Essentially, violence down the hierarchy, meaning dangerous work environments, police beating protesters, a poor person being evicted onto the street, is acceptable within our current system. So Berkman concludes, the way the system works is that it makes competition for resources and hierarchy treated like inherent parts of our nature, or at least unchallenged aspects of our culture. Chapter 5. Unemployment. Berkman obviously starts by addressing Marxist concept of the reserve army of labor, stating, it is to the profit of the capitalist to keep an army of unemployed ready at hand. It is part and parcel of the wage system, a necessary and inevitable characteristic of it. But it doesn't take an economist to know that our demands in the workplace won't likely be met if there's a slew of out-of-work and desperate people willing to do our jobs under worse conditions and for less. Berkman elaborates, capitalism is not interested in employing all those who want to be able to work. On the contrary, a minimum of hands and a maximum of effort is the principle and the profit of the capitalist system. Like the CGP Grey video, humans need not apply, an interesting struggle in our society is that as an individual, each person needs income to be able to receive food, clothing, and shelter. And yet, so much of our modern future economy requires very little of the actual workforce to work, as more and more customer service and transportation jobs are replaced by automation. Berkman concludes, so the capitalist system of production for profit results in this crazy situation. 1. People have to starve. Not because there's not enough food, but because there is too much of it. They have to do without the things they need because there's too much of those things on hand. 2. Because there is too much, manufacturers cut down, throwing thousands out of work. 3. Being out of work and therefore not earning, those thousands lose their buying capacity. As Michael Prenny has argued, people think about American prosperity as due to capitalism. But in fact, capitalist Thailand or capitalist India are much closer to actual capitalism, with few taxes, few worker protections, and widespread desperate poverty. However, Western countries with high standards of living owe that standard of living to the struggles of working people against capitalism, and not out of any particular concern capitalism has for a high standard of living. Chapter 6. War. The American capitalist appeals to his government to protect American interests. The capitalists of France, Germany, and England do the same. They call upon their governments to protect their profits. Then, the various governments call upon their people to defend their country. Berkman is defining imperialism. As President Woodrow Wilson said, the doors of the nations which are closed should be battered down. Chapter 7. Church and School. Obey! That is the eternal cry of church and school, no matter how vile the tyrant, no matter how oppressive and unjust law and order. Certainly I do believe these are major factors of these institutions, but there is a lot that goes unnamed here. For example, the church offers guilt-free apathy through prayer and tithing rather than actually improving the world, or that praying for forgiveness provides us with a pressure valve to release the guilt from overindulging or from not helping someone in need. And for the school's part, sure, it teaches respect for authority, etc., but school also demonstrates that constant boredom is an acceptable part of life. There's too much that these institutions provide for maintaining the system that go unaddressed here. Chapter 8. Justice. Berkman states, "Authority corrupts its holder and debases its victim." The phrase power corrupts is more common, but I like this version better because it addresses the victim as well. Berkman is arguing that we all start out somewhere closer to equal, but when people are pushed below others, they become debased, less than, or as Alexander Humboldt states, "We may admire what he does, but we despise what he is." And at the same time, the person with authority who is elevated over others becomes usurpacious, begins to lack empathy, and becomes corrupted. Berkman then discusses the legal system, arguing that judges and lawyers, and I would add politicians to that list, exist as beneficiaries of the current system, and so they frame decisions around justifying the current system which has served them well. For example, Michael Parenti asks why it is that scores of police are immediately sent in when a bank is robbed, yet maybe they send out one squad car to investigate a rape. Or as Derek Jensen has argued, why are riot police out in force to stop protesters from confronting a capitalist, but the police wouldn't lift a finger to stop that same capitalist from creating an environmental destruction that leads to the deaths of scores of people? This is part of the hierarchy thing from Chapter 4 as well. Berkman then provides several historical examples from American labor history and communist witch hunts to demonstrate the government and court's very class-biased concept of justice. Ending the chapter, Berkman comes to the following conclusions. 1. There is only class justice in a war of capital against labor. There can be no justice for labor under capitalism. 2. Law and government, as well as all other capitalist institutions, the press, the school, the church, the police, and courts, are always at the service of capital against labor. Whatever the merit of any given case, capital and government are twins with one common interest. 3. Capital and government will use any and all means to keep the proletariat in subjection. They will terrorize the working class and ruthlessly murder its most intelligent and devoted members. It cannot be otherwise, because there is a life and death struggle between capital and labor. Next, there's a few chapters that address the various flawed groups offering solutions to societal ills, such as the church, legal reforms, trade unions, etc. Chapter 9. Can the church help you? Berkman says no, because the church wants you to turn to a leader, a god, a pastor, but the anarchist wants you to turn to yourself as authority. As the Dead Prez lyric from No Way Is the Way states,
Black life so hard. They say you're not supposed to question God. Well, is it okay to question the pastor? Was it passed down from the slave master? It was only the truth I was after, but I never could get a straight answer.
Chapter 10. Reformer and Politician. The reformer thinks he can make people better by law. This whole chapter looks like the actor versus stage argument, which claims that it is better to remove the entire corrupt stage, aka revolution, than to remove one bad actor at a time, aka reform. Berkman critiques the reformers for looking to easy prohibition rather than solving complex problems, simply banning drugs rather than looking at the complex problems that lead to people's destructive use of drugs. As Berkman states, he pretends to have made you better by compelling you to be a hypocrite. Berkman jests. It has been established that poverty and unemployment, with their attendant misery and despair, are the chief sources of crime. Is there any law to prevent poverty and unemployment? Obviously not. Berkman concludes, the whole system of law and government is a machine to keep the workers enslaved and to rob them of their toil. Every social reform whose realization depends on law and government is already thereby doomed to failure. This reminds me of the guy who'd faced hate crime charges for defacing a Christopher Columbus statue. Laws serve to validate the current system, and even good laws can be used against you. It is for this reason I'm hesitant to trust laws that promise economic or environmental reform, because they're often just greenwashing and lack real substance. The same goes the other way. Why would I trust a gun reform bill when a left-leaning protester would receive harsh jail time for an unregistered firearm, and yet right-wing terrorist groups go completely unimpeded? Chapter 11. The Trade Union. This chapter is a critique of business-friendly unionism and is essentially arguing that trade unionism is to radical unionism what reform is to radical politics. But I've just gone over all this when I reviewed the rise and repression of radical labor, so we'll skip it. Chapter 12. Whose is the power? Berkman argues that the masses truly hold the wealth, for they created the production of society. So too he argues that they hold all the power. He states, the government and the capitalists, the political and financial rulers, would find out that all their boasted power and strength disappear when the people refuse to acknowledge them as master, refuse to let them lord it over them. Berkman continues, only the people, the masses, have power. He concludes, the strength of government and capital is external, outside of themselves. The strength of labor is not external. It lies in itself, in its ability to work and create. It is the only real power. Chapter 13, Socialism. As Berkman clarified anarchism at the start of the text, he does the same here for socialism, stating true socialism does not mean to improve capitalism, but to abolish it altogether. Efforts to reform and improve capitalism are directly opposed to socialism and only delay its realization. Berkman explains, the land, machinery, mills, factories, mines, railroads, and other public utilities should not be owned privately, because such ownership enslaves the workers as well as mankind in general. He continues, social inequalities and injustice would be eliminated, the classes would be abolished, and all men would become free and equal. These views of socialism are also in full accord with the ideals of most anarchists. Michael Alber, however, critiques this view of classlessness that socialism would so-called invoke. He claims that the worker-controlled factories in Argentina, for example, saw classes emerge in the types of work people would do. Sure, people were much better off in the worker-controlled factories than under capitalism. Yet, when the working positions of the job stayed the same, the engaging and rewarding jobs became the new upper class, while the remedial and so-called grunt work became the lower class. Michael Albert's solution here in participatory economics is the concept of balanced job complexes, where rewarding and grunt work is equally shared among the entire workforce. Moving right along, here Berkman critiques socialists, arguing that they have moved away from revolutionary action and moved to focus on electing socialist politicians. Berkman states, in other words, they have ceased to be revolutionists. They have become reformers who want to change things by law, which is doomed to fail according to Chapter 10. Berkman continues, even with the best intentions, socialists in legislative bodies or in government positions find themselves entirely powerless to accomplish anything of a socialistic nature, anything of benefit to the workers. For politics is not a means to better the conditions of labor. It never was and never can be. Or as John Dewey has put it, as long as politics is the shadow cast on society by big business, the attenuation of the shadow will not change the substance. Berkman doesn't place all the blame on elected socialists themselves, however. He acknowledges that they are but a small minority in a system of vastly different ideologies, and in a system written for the benefit of certain primary ideologies. Chapter 14, The February Revolution. Berkman starts the chapter by explaining that many upheavals seek to overthrow political power, but the February Revolution was particularly important because it sought economic revolution as well. This chapter is simply a historical account of the February Revolution. Chapter 15, Between February and October. Here Berkman describes the many political facets of Russia during the revolution, namely the constitutional democrats, the social democrats, the social revolutionaries, and the anarchists. He describes the philosophies of each group and their goals. The final group of this list Berkman gives a full chapter to. That is, of course, the Bolsheviks. Chapter 16, The Bolsheviks. Berkman starts the chapter explaining where Bolshevism started. The history of this period is fairly well known, but essentially Berkman explains the various provincial governments that were established and fell away. Oddly, the US, English, French, etc. invasion of Russia goes completely unmentioned. Chapter 17, Revolution and Dictatorship. Because dictatorship would meet with the strongest opposition, not from the bourgeoisie, but from the truly revolutionary classes, which consider dictatorship inimical to the best interests of the revolution, the elimination of these would therefore be a prime necessity to any political party seeking dictatorship. This is an unfortunate outcome often beset upon groups who've newly risen to power. Either the moderates or the extremists of that group will seek to eliminate the other rather than working together, out of fear that splitting them apart will cause them to lose their gained power. The Bolsheviks sought to hold state power by driving out the more radical communists and anarchists in their midst. Finally, Chapter 18, The Dictatorship at Work. In this chapter, Berkman essentially lays out the various ways and examples of how the dictatorship of the proletariat was in fact simply the dictatorship of Lenin. Berkman then lays out all the principal aims of the revolution and explains how the new Russian government failed to meet those aims. Berkman claims and explains how the political aims, the economic, cultural, social, and moral aims of the Russian Revolution all failed. Berkman concludes, "Today, Russia is a country partly state capitalistic and partly privately capitalistic." In conclusion, this text is a very good intro to both communist and anarchist thought. At only 115 pages, it's a really light, easy read to loan a friend or someone in need of understanding these concepts better. The last few chapters may have been more relevant at the time the text was written, and as I'd said before, maybe a modern equivalent to these chapters would be explaining to left-leaning people why Obama's leftist-leaning policies failed to meet the goals of his supporters, and that communist anarchism would have met those goals. The bulk of the text, however, is, like the Communist Manifesto before it, simply lays out clearly and concisely a critique of our society and offers the theory of communist anarchism as a solution. Both communism and anarchism are defined clearly here. Oddly, the societal issues Berkman addresses are eerily relevant to the struggles of late capitalism we face today, which is why I would definitely recommend this book. If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.